Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Never Mind the Dam Busters, the podcast that looks beyond aircraft and operations to explore the people, decisions and consequences behind RAF Bomber Command and the wider air war of the Second World War. I'm Jane Gulliford-Lowes, and for this episode I'm flying solo once again, but I'm delighted to be joined by a guest who is very familiar to regular listeners. Professor Alan Allport has been with us before, most memorably in episode 8 when we talked about Arthur Harris and area bombing. And again in episode 34, Writing the Bomber War, the Official Histories Controversy, where we delved into how Bomber Command has been remembered and written about in official history. Alan is Professor of History at Syracuse University and the author of several acclaimed books on Britain and the Second World War. His work, including Britain at Bay, which is one of my personal favourites, has helped deepen our understanding of how strategy, policy and memory intersected in the bombing war and in the war in general, and we're delighted to have him back on the show. Now, today we're going to be talking about Alan's latest book, Advance Britannia, which is kind of the follow-up to Britain at Bay. It's how the Second World War was won, 1942 to 1945. So it's a sweeping account of Britain's war effort from its darkest moments through to the victory and, importantly, the aftermath. Alan, welcome back to Never Mind the Dam Busters. It's a real pleasure to have you back with us again.
Thank you very much, Jane. It's a pleasure to be here from a very snowy Syracuse.
I was going to say, I hope it's not too cold where you are. It's absolutely freezing here, but we certainly haven't had the 2 feet of snow like you've had, so that's good news. Now, Advance Britannia focuses on the later years of the war, or the second half of the war, if you want to put it that way, when Britain had moved from survival to sustained large-scale offences. So our focus today is on how Britain navigated the war after 1942, when the conflict truly became global, when new coalitions formed, and when strategic decisions had deep consequences, not just for the military outcome, but for British society itself. This was also the period when Bomber Command reached the height of its power and also the height of its controversy. So this feels like a perfect moment to explore how your work reframes our understanding of that phase of the conflict. Now, the first issue I wanted to chat to you about is the sort of core arguments in the book. So Advance Britannia covers an immense span of time and subject matter, from military strategy to social transformation. And at the heart of the book is the idea that the war from 42 to 45 must be understood not just as a series of battles, which I think is how many people tend to sort of remember it, but as a complex interaction between politics, society, culture and empire. How do you encapsulate that central argument and that central theme for our listeners?
Oh, gosh, what a good question. All right, it's difficult to answer, though. But let me start by saying, or using a term which was originally coined by Corelli Barnett. He talked about the idea of the audit of war in the 20th century, and by which he meant the kind of test of national institutions that took place in the context of total war. I guess what my book looks at is this audit of war for the United Kingdom and for the wider British world across multiple dimensions. So it's an audit of military, political, social, economic, diplomatic, and cultural power. And Britain had to pass this test in order to achieve victory. Moreover, it had to pass the test on a fundamentally different kind of battlefield than the one that it had prepared for when it had originally declared war in 1939. So this new volume looks at the war from roughly from Pearl Harbor in December 1941 until VJ Day. And the war that Britain fights during that period is radically different from the one that it had begun. So back in September 1939, Britain, of course, had been in alliance with France, and it had gone to war against one single enemy, Germany, in Europe. Now, by the time this book begins, it's lost France as an ally. It has gained two new allies in the form of the Soviet Union and the United States. But it also faces another two great powers, or perhaps one and a half great powers, depending on how you count Italy. The British have to fight the Germans, they have to fight the Japanese, and they have to fight across a genuinely global battlefield now, which stretches not just across Europe, but also through the Mediterranean and all the way to East Asia and Southeast Asia. Now, Britain, of course, ultimately passes the audit. I guess it's probably not a huge spoiler to say that Britain ultimately is on the winning side in the war. Probably most of your audience will already know that. And despite a lot of rather humiliating battlefield defeats in the beginning of this period, which the book talks about, things like the surrenders at Singapore and Tobruk and Burma, it ultimately prevails because it has a sound grand strategy. It can win a war of attrition because it commands the seas. It can draw upon most of the world's manpower and raw materials. But here's the paradox. Britain had entered the war as what you might call a satisfied power. In other words, it didn't really have anything particularly it wanted to actually gain out of the war. It didn't want to get new territory. It didn't want to achieve anything new. All it wanted to do was to preserve what it already had. But every other belligerent in the war, and I don't just mean the Germans and the Japanese, I also mean the Americans and the Russians too, were not satisfied powers. They wanted to remake the international order. And so Britain is therefore in this slightly strange position of fighting to create a new world order that is going to inevitably reduce its own power and status. Neville Chamberlain, I think, had recognized this in 1939, which was one of the reasons why he was so reluctant to go to war. Churchill, I think, comes to recognize this as well. Victory will be real, but it will come at a cost of Britain's traditional great power position. And so the book examines how the British navigate this contradiction across all the dimensions of the war, through mobilizing resources, managing alliance, making strategic choices, and confronting the moral compromises that are required by the kind of industrial scale violence that the war will mean. Winning is not going to mean the restoration of the pre-war world. It's going to mean managing decline, and while extracting the best possible terms from stronger partners who have their own and very different visions of what the post-war world is supposed to be.
Now, you just touched on sort of allies and strategy there. And in the book, you explore the shifting alliances and especially, obviously, the evolving relationships between Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, and how these shaped strategy. Can you discuss how Britain's position changed after 42, or from 42 onwards, and how Churchill's leadership adapted to the demands of a global coalition war?
Sure. Well, the war in September 1939 had been very different because the Anglo-French alliance had been won between genuinely equal powers. And if anything, actually, Britain had often been in the driver's seat of that alliance. And when France falls in June 1940, for about a year after that, Churchill can pretty much make Allied policy himself, single-handedly, for the best part of a year, because Britain's really the only great power that's still in the fight. But this starts to change once the Soviet Union enters the war in June 1941, and then especially once the Americans are in after Pearl Harbor. Churchill, while he's glad of the Allies, he also has to accept that he's now only one voice among three, and he's not necessarily the most dominant voice. And that voice is going to grow progressively quieter as the war continues. So if we think about the relationship between the two main heads of state that he has to deal with, Stalin and Roosevelt, we think about Stalin first. I mean, that's a very, very tortured relationship built upon mutual suspicion. I mean, Churchill had famously spent decades calling the Kremlin a criminal regime. Stalin saw Churchill as a dangerous bourgeois statesman who was secretly hoping that the Nazis would destroy the Soviet Union. And in order to make the alliance work, they have to sort of try and move beyond this. And there's an awful lot of theatricality to it. It's a fascinating story when Churchill goes to visit Stalin for the first time in August 1942, and he travels to Moscow. And they have they almost played this sort of game over several nights of, on one night, cordial cooperation and all bon ami and happiness. And then the following night, these kind of furious accusations that go back and forth and so on. And it's all very performative. And ultimately, that they're able to sort of, make some kind of, get to some kind of agreement. I think actually by the end of the war, Churchill rather imagines that he has sort of figured Stalin out and that they have a good relationship. I'm not entirely sure if Stalin himself actually ever thought about it that way. And I wonder actually whether Churchill was a little bit naive in thinking that he had sort of, won Stalin round. But then again, the relationship that Churchill had with Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not a particularly straightforward one.
No,
either.
absolutely not.
On the face of it, they shared a lot in common. They both had kind of patrician backgrounds. There was probably a certain amount of shared chemistry, as we would say nowadays, between them, that they did have a lot in common. But they had fundamentally different ideas about what the war should be about. As I've said, Churchill represents a satisfied power. He wants to preserve the pre-war order. Roosevelt sees the war as an opportunity to sweep away all empires, and particularly the British Empire, which I think he just regarded as an 18th century anachronism. FDR is also maddeningly elusive as a negotiating partner. So he is one of these people that will always, in a room, will be all smiles and will tell you exactly what he thinks you want to hear. But he never really commits himself to anything, especially not on paper. And he rarely follows through. You never quite know whether you've got him or whether he'll slip through your fingers, is what one person said about him. And I think the relationship between Churchill and FDR gets a lot worse, actually, as the war goes on. I think FDR, it doesn't help, of course, that he is suffering from increasing ill health, but I think he starts to rather tire of Churchill. I think he finds his company a little bit more irritating as time goes on. And I suspect that Churchill, for his part, becomes quietly embittered by some of the refusal of FDR to go along with some of his strategic ideas. So it's interesting. So Churchill's got two very valuable, but also very difficult kind of strategic partners to have to work with. And I think one of the things that he realizes as the war goes on is that the way he can maintain Britain's position is by visible military contributions to the fight against the Axis. In other words, military operations for the British are not just about defeating the Germans or the Japanese. They're also about preserving Britain's seat at the conference table, particularly because there are going to be so many important negotiations which are going to take place about what the post-war world is going to look like. So if you want to try and understand why the British do certain things, especially I think by the time you get to 1944 and 1945, it's not just about military operations. It's also about having a kind of presence in the fight, which ensures the British are going to participate in the victory negotiations that are going to finally determine what the world is look like.
Yeah. And I think that's something that obviously we're going to talk about next. And that's the role of Bomber Command and the air war. And that's certainly one of the main demonstrations of British military power, if you like, at this particular time. So how do you situate Bomber Command within the broader sweep of Britain's war effort at this time anyway? And what does the bombing offensive tell us about British strategy and society at this stage of the conflict, do you think?
Well, I ended up writing quite a lot about Bomber Command because I think one of the things that came clear to me as I was completing the second book was just how much strategic bombing was kind of core to Britain's making of war between 1939 and 1945. I mean, it was embedded in British war planning right from the beginning. And it very much appeals to strategists because it's a way of being able to use machinery in order to project force rather than manpower.
Steel, not flesh.
Even before the war had begun, of course. Right, steel, not flesh. And even before the war had begun, there had been, massive pre-war investments. So even in 1938, at the time of the Munich crisis, they were already planning on having 85 heavy bomber squadrons by March 1942. And by heavy bombers, of course, they do mean the four-engine bombers that we become familiar with later in the war. So the Short Stirling, your beloved Halifax, and the Avro Manchester, these all made their maiden flights. They were all in preparation. ICI is busy stockpiling magnesium in order to be able to produce millions of incendiary bombs, even before the war has begun. So when you start to, calculate all this up, things like the enormous investment in the Ministry of Aircraft Production and the Ministry of Supply in order to make the bombs, all the airfield construction program, the training schemes, and so on. These are enormous sunk costs. And they create a lot of institutional momentum. I think one of the things that becomes clear once you get to 1942 is whether or not people at that stage think that strategic bombing is the right way to go. There is a kind of path dependency built in by this point. In other words, there's tremendous pressure to continue the campaign simply because so much has already been invested in it, that it's very difficult to imagine kind of scrapping it, starting from scratch and looking at something else. Kind of Britain's made its bet by that point, and it has to stick with it. And of course, the strategic bombing war goes through many stages. So, originally, before the war, it had basically been perceived as being a deterrent in order to try and prevent a war in the first place. That fails. Then it's sort of considered to be a potential kind of nuclear option. So, in May 1940, when the decision is originally made to bomb the Ruhr, there is this idea that this will be this sort of, devastating campaign which will, stop the Germans' attack on France, that it will sort of have this truly sort of, rapid and transformative effect on the war, none of which, of course, actually happens. The first raid on the Ruhr cities kills a German dairyman who's walking to his lavatory, and that's it. The early raids are deeply disappointing. And so you go through that period then of what you might call better than nothing. In other words, the campaign continues, not because it's perceived as having really any great effect. It isn't, but because it's about the only way after Dunkirk that Britain can actually take the fight to the enemy. And even really well into 1942, it's having very limited kind of actual effect. It's not really until you get to 1943 that you start to have consistent raids that are genuinely having some kind of effect on the German economy. And, you've got the Battle of the Ruhr, you've got of course, the most notoriously the Hamburg firestorm in July 1943, showing that bombing can actually inflict massive damage. Arthur Harris, of course, Sir Arthur Harris believed that it could win the war alone without the need for an invasion of the European mainland. I don't think Churchill ever really thought that, but he did support the campaign as a major contribution to victory. And it becomes an important kind of complement to Operation Overlord in the spring of 1944. And then in the final winter of the war, it's both a way to kind of smash what's left of the German economy and also, I think, maybe to try and overawe the Soviets a little bit, by this kind of demonstration of Anglo-American power. You asked about the social effects of it. I think the thing, we'll maybe talk a little bit more about this later on, but I think the campaign really tests Britain's self-image as an innocent people. I've used the expression shire folk in those books to talk a little bit about this idea.
I enjoyed those analogies, yes.
Of a sort of British self-conception. In the second half of the war, 25 German civilians die for every British civilian. Britain turns out to be rather good at industrial scale killing, much better than the Germans had ever actually been against them, at least. The British public supports the bombing. The government always remains a bit cagey about acknowledging what it actually means or what is actually happening. There's a huge gap between rhetoric and reality, I think, in those final years of the war. The government's never entirely honest with the public about what area bombing means. And I think the public also is not entirely honest with itself about choosing to ask the kind of questions that probably needed to be asked.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Kind of keeping on with the sort of social theme then, I think one of the themes that it's brought out brilliantly in the book is the lived experience of total war and how this sort of impacts on all levels of society, really. And that from the reviews I've read of the book, and one of the strengths that reviewers have noted is how the book brings out not just the grand strategy, but the lived realities of the British people from ration books to air raid shelters, etc. How did this idea of total war affect British civilians and service personnel alike from 42 onwards? And why is the social side of the story so important to be told, do you think?
Well, I think that, trying to talk about the macro and the micro together and kind of in dialogue with each other, I think is really important. We want to get at the human stories, don't we? But on the other hand, we also need context for trying to understand, what they mean within this kind of bigger picture. I think it's interesting because the first half of the war, the half that I really covered in Britain at Bay, is really the kind of heroic period for the British. It's the period, especially for civilians, of the greatest drama, the greatest danger. London, in the height of the big blitz, is the sort of the center of the world stage. There's the sense that these are kind of existential stakes, the finest hour, a sense of living through a kind of epic. The second half of the war is a more quotidian experience, I think. I mean, one of the things about it, of course, is that if you're a British civilian, it's generally speaking a lot safer. The period from the end of the Blitz in May 1941 to the end of 1943 is probably the safest period of all for British civilians. You get the V weapon campaign in 1944, beginning of 1945, but even then, the death toll is much less than it had been in the big Blitz, and it's mostly concentrated on London. Now, having said all that, though, the strain of total war is probably much greater in the second half of the war than it had been in the first. So by the time you get to mid-1943, Britain is mobilized to its limits. Even though it only has a population that's about a third of America's, it's conducting a war, simultaneous land campaigns in the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean. It's fighting the Battle of the Atlantic. It's, of course, waging the strategic bomber war. This is an enormous material commitment from a country which is basically run out of manpower completely. There's nobody left to mobilize. And I think one of the things that comes out most strongly from kind of civilian accounts of the period is just the sort of the drabness and the austerity of it all. Food imports have been reduced, rationing had been tightened. Everything is starting to sort of wear out. Everything's sort of worn and shabby by the time you get to 1942, 1943. Everybody is tired. Everybody is hungry. Everybody is irritated. There's no more heroic resistance anymore. This is sort of just the kind of the grim,
the grim grind,
quotidian, pedestrian grind of going through something where you know that you are probably going to win in the end. But my goodness, it seems so very far away, for so long. Now, however, it's intriguing, however, because one of the things that the war had brought for all of these irritations and deprivations, what it had done is had eliminated unemployment, which had been the great fear of the 1920s and 1930s. So if you look, you're close to your heart, Jane, is somewhere like Sunderland or somewhere, or the Tyne and Wear area. These had been the places that had been kind of exemplary of the slump in the 1930s.
Very much so.
All of the the northeastern shipbuilding towns by 1942, 1943 are booming. They're reopening dockyards in order to build ships as fast as possible. Everybody is now working again. And even though the cost of living has gone up, real wages are increasing too.
Yeah.
Full employment, overtime pay. And I think the prestige as well of the working class has never been so high, the prestige and the confidence. And I think the great fear actually by the time you get to 1942 is what will happen with the peace. Is everybody going to be back on the dole again? Are we going to be back to, the kind of miseries of the 1930s? Which is why I think when you think about something like the Beveridge Report at the end of 1942, this kind of scheme for a social welfare system, this has to be seen as a kind of insurance policy against a future which could, people are sort of regard as being very, very uncertain. This desire to kind of create a guarantee that all of these gains that have been seen in wartime won't be stolen away. And actually, we think about the kind of the story of the Beveridge Report now as being this very sort of Whiggish one about, of a kind of, progressive victory. But that's not the way it's actually seen at the time, because by the beginning of 1943, it seems as though the government has basically decided that they're going to, take a pass on Beveridge, that it's probably never really going to work out. At least that's the impression that people have been given by a good deal of sort of shiftiness on the part of the government. And what you're getting then is accusations that the people have been sold out, that, that this is, there's this huge amount of kind of suspicion and resentment about the idea that, at the end of the day, they're all the same. This includes the Labour Party, incidentally, the establishment Labour Party. Oh, they're all the same. The parties are all, none of them can be trusted. And that we're going to be left on the dole. We're going to be left on the scrappy when this is all finished. So my own view is one of the ways you really need to think about the 1945 election is very much a kind of rebellion against this. This isn't about sort of a positive adoption of socialist ideals or anything like that, but rather a kind of punishment of the government, because of this sense that people are worried that the small gains that they've made during the war are going to be taken away from them. They're worried about being cheated at the end of all of this.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned the northeast of England. I mean, as you probably know, my family come from a coal mining background. I'm descended from 5 generations of coal miners on both sides of my family. And even in 1940, in the small town that I grew up in, obviously I wasn't around in 1940, but my great-grandfather and his colleagues at the local collieries, they were all still on short hours. So even sort of late 1940, because there was no work for them to do. And it was only when industrial production began to get sort of ramped up in 41, 42, that they suddenly went from working short hours or having no hours at all. That wasn't uncommon. Sometimes the collieries would close for weeks on end. To being asked to work 12-hour shifts, 6 or 7 days a week, which caused a great deal of upheaval at the time, as you can imagine. Yeah. And then people are wondering, well, is that going to continue? Are we going to have this once the war is over, or are we going to go back to how the bad old days, how things used to be?
This is the paradox of total war. It can get you killed. It can get your loved ones killed. On the other hand, if you survive it, then it's probably good for you. It probably means that your standard of living will increase. It probably means that your real wages will increase. And this has been true in World War I as well.
Yeah, very much so. So I want to kind of cast down a little bit further afield now and talk about the impact on empire, Commonwealth and global perspectives. So after 1942, the war is truly global, as you've touched on. And Britain obviously is being pulled in myriad directions. But we can't forget the role that the empire and Commonwealth played in changing roles in the conflict. How does Advance Britannia handle the imperial dimension of the war? And how did the demands of total war accelerate the pressures on empire, do you think?
Good question. Well, I think Britain has a global war in a way which makes it unique amongst all of the combatants. Britain, of course, and its empire controls formally or informally, most of the world's manpower supply and most of its raw materials through command of the seas. And this is the huge strategic advantage that the British have, that they're able to draw on all of these kinds of commercial and material resources from the Indian Ocean, from Africa, from the Dominions. When we talk about Britain's war, we really should be talking about empire's war, because it's fought and it's paid for by millions across the globe.
Very
so
much
one of the more fascinating things for me when I was researching the bombing war was to understand just how imperial the bombing war was. I mean, for one thing, Commonwealth airmen form about half of Bomber Command's force by the end of the war. But even if you go beyond manpower, if you think about the kind of materials that were required to actually make a bombing campaign. So, for instance, about the aluminium that's required in order to make aircraft, about 60% of that comes from Canadian bauxite, which is originally mined in British Guyana. The 100-octane aviation fuel that you need to get a heavy bomber into the air over Germany comes from Venezuela and the Caribbean. Ultimately, I found some fascinating statistics about Operation Gomorrah, the raids on Hamburg. So that took 2 million gallons of fuel, 70,000 gallons of engine oil, and everything from coffee from Kenya and sugar from Cuba in the flasks, the kiosks, the drink flasks of the airmen, in order to put all that stuff over a German city. So you have to think about bombing as being a kind of militarized globalization. And also Britain pays for the war through the empire too. I think this is one of the stories that's largely forgotten today. Much of the world, not, including the empire, but also parts outside the formal empire too, are part of what's called the sterling balance system. In other words, they either use the pound as their reserve currency or their own currencies are pegged to the pound. And what this basically means is that Britain can take enormous loans, interest-free, from other parts of the world and set its own terms about how it will eventually pay these back. It's a financial mechanism that makes the war sustainable, but it also means offloading an awful lot of the pain of the war from the United Kingdom onto the indigent peasantry of the world, especially India.
Mm-hmm.
It creates consequences as well because of the fact that you're taking you're making such enormous burdens upon the empire. This is going to mean that the terms of empire are going to have to be renegotiated when all this is over. The stability of the empire had always rested on the idea that the imperial peoples were not going to be asked to contribute a great deal in terms of imperial defense. Well, the Second World War shows that's clearly not true anymore. But if you're going to make greater contributions, that means you're going to demand a greater voice. You're going to have a desire for greater autonomy. And this plays out in lots of different ways. So, for instance, when we think about the Dominions, there's a demand for more independent operations as the war goes on.
Which Sixth Group is a perfect example. Sixth Group Bomber Command and the contribution of the Canadians. Sorry. Sixth Group was almost sort of entirely consisting of Canadians by the end of the war, both the aircrew and the ground staff, because they wanted to have that sort of element of control, I guess.
Yeah, and there's a Canadian army that fights sort of quasi-independently in northwestern Europe after D-Day. The Australians want to have their own troops, under their own command, fighting in the Pacific rather than in the Middle East as the war goes on. So the Dominions are looking increasingly both to themselves and also to Washington rather than London. And then, of course, with India, you have this massive expansion of the Indian army, which proves extremely important for the war in the Mediterranean, the war in Southeast Asia. But that is going to mean concessions to the nationalist demands of the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. All of this shows that Britain's victory is imperial, but it's also very Pyrrhic in lots of ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have the ability to mobilize these kind of global forces but by doing so, you are going to accelerate the very forces that are going to dismantle the empire. It is no coincidence that just a few years after victory in 1945, India will be independent, Burma will be independent, and the process is only going to accelerate after that.
Now, one other thing that runs through your work, Alan, is the difference between how war is remembered and how it was experienced. And I think it's fair to say that Advance Britannia challenges some of the traditional narratives around the British war effort. How should modern readers think about the myths of the Second World War, which there are many, and what does your book try to correct or illuminate in that regard?
So I think the central myth that both volumes in this series try and get at is the myth of Britain's war as privileging character over structure. What I mean by that is the British have always tended to interpret victory in the war because of who they are rather than because of what they could do. The Shire folk myth that I've mentioned before is that essentially the reason the British win is because they have those kind of hobbit-like qualities. They are innocent, they are plucky, they are amateur geniuses who can muddle through with, gumption and guile. I don't think that had anything to do with it at all. I think the reality is that Britain wins or is part of a winning coalition because of what it's capable of. It's capable of massive professional mobilization of state-directed violence on an industrial scale, as you would expect from a kind of, a first-rank industrial power. That's a little bit troubling because of what it says about us. The thing is that the British proved very good at committing violence, area bombing, of course, other kinds of industrial scale killing. I think this is the reason why we prefer the plucky Brit myth. We like to think that the reason that we won was because we were the underdogs, not because we were capable of committing violence at a kind of global scale. I think that when you look at the way that the kind of cultural memory of the war was created, starting in the late 40s and then through the 1950s and the 1960s, it's very much one that emphasized that plucky Brit idea. So if you think about some of these kind of classic movies, like, The Cruel Sea or The Colditz Story or The Cockleshell Heroes or things like this. These are films, these are stories that privilege covert small unit behind enemy lines actions. This is the sort of the world of SOE. It's the world of the commandos. Later, of course, with the ultra secret, you'd have Bletchley Park. We have the story of Operation Mincemeat, which people can't get enough of.
Yeah.
The story of the SAS. This is not a story about the industrial grind of total mass conflict. Nobody's ever made a movie about the Hamburg raid, even though it is arguably the single most significant act that the British committed throughout the Second World War. What we have instead, of course, is the Dam Busters, to give a shout out to your title. And I do think that it is significant that the Dam Busters is almost the only British film about strategic bombing that ever achieved any lasting cultural purchase. Because, what does the Dam Busters do? It portrays bombing as clinical,
Precise,
triumphant, morally unambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, precise. It's precision bombing. It's everything that the Bomber Command's war wasn't.
Yeah, exactly.
This is what people want to remember the bombing war as. That rather than think about the devastating but morally much more ambiguous thing that it actually was.
Yeah. And this kind of links in with my next question, really. Obviously, for many of our listeners, Bomber Command and its air crews are a central interest. And though Advance Britannia is broad in scope, what do you think it says specifically about the air war, about Bomber Command's strategic role, the political debates around it, and its place in the story of 1942 to 1945?
Well, the three questions that everybody always asks about the area bombing war are: first, did it work? Second, was it legal? And third, was it moral? So I go to some length to talk about all of these things, I think, in the book. I will give you the nutshell answer that I have, my own personal view about all of these things. Did it work? Well, it partly depends upon what time period we're talking about. If you mean up to the end of 1942, the beginning of 1943, no. I think it's very hard to look at that period and say that Bomber Command's efforts had actually amounted to anything in particular. In fact, it's remarkable that in 1942, more RAF aircrew were still being killed every year than were German civilians being killed by the bombs. Now, from 1943 onwards, that does, of course, start to change. And the Battle of the Ruhr is a watershed in that sense, in that it is the first sustained campaign from the air, which really does have some significant effect upon the enemy economy. Bomber Command was never able to achieve what Arthur Harris would have liked, which was to win the war by itself and make an invasion of Europe unnecessary. But it does contribute, I think, very significantly to German defeat in the end. In the final 7 months of the war, the RAF dropped about 344,000 tons of bombs on Germany, which is equivalent to about 17 Hiroshima bombs. Yeah. It's very hard to imagine doing something like that and it not having some kind of effect on the country that you're doing it to. And I think if you think about the bombing war in a holistic way with the American precision bombing going on at the same time. I don't actually think there is a sort of this debate that goes on about, area versus precision bombing. I'm not personally convinced that that's a very fruitful way of thinking about it, because I think especially in those final 18 months or so of the war, both methods are used simultaneously. Both make the other more effective.
Mm-hmm.
Area bombing makes precision bombing more effective. Precision bombing makes area bombing more effective. And I'm not sure that concentrating on one alone would have had the same kind of effect.
Yeah. It's that
so when you think about that
thing,
you also
isn't it?
think
Yeah.
about, yeah, right. You put, in very different ways, the German economy and the German society under this enormous amount of stress, and something is going to give eventually. And in the sort of third quarter of 1944, eventually it does start to give. So, to me, I've never really had any problem with the idea that area bombing does ultimately, play a pretty significant role in Germany's collapse, although it was never going to be able to do it by itself, as I think Harris would have liked.
Yeah.
If we have to think about kind of hindsight questions, I think probably the single biggest British mistake is not taking more seriously the idea of counterforce strategy in the war. In other words, thinking about long-range escort fighters to destroy the Luftwaffe in the air, something that, of course, the Americans started to do in early 1944. Although, it took the Americans long enough to get there too. So, we should give them that. Now, was the bombing legal? I don't think it was obviously illegal. I think if you look at the kind of international rules that existed in 1939, the RAF's lawyers, and they did look at this question quite clearly, argued, I think reasonably enough, that there were no strict rules which said that you couldn't area bomb. This was all changed, of course, from 1945 onwards. But, at the time, there wasn't anything that was clearly illegal.
The thing is, as well, though, none of this had ever been done before. So, what's your precedent in terms of legal? This is me speaking as a lawyer. There isn't any.
Well, essentially, that's what the RAF's legal branch said, is that, it's neither clearly legal or illegal. It is, this kind of thing wasn't really clarified until, we have the, post-war changes in international law. Now it would be illegal without question, but that's not something that, as historians, that needs to preoccupy us particularly. Now, the final question: was it moral? For me, that's largely an open question. I think people have to make a decision for themselves.
Yeah.
I think, to some extent, it depends upon how much weight you accord to the traditional idea of what's called jus in bello, or justice in war. So there's a long Western Christian tradition that goes all the way back to St. Augustine, to Thomas Aquinas, says that there are some things that you just don't do in war, regardless of whatever the outcome might be. In other words, you don't think about the consequences. You simply think about the idea that there are some things you just shouldn't do. One of those things, traditionally, is the idea of discrimination. In other words, that you mustn't treat civilians and non-civilians as the same in terms of targets. You have a duty not only to refrain from direct and intentional attacks on civilians, but also to take responsibility for protecting civilians from harm. That is clearly not what happened during the Second World War. Arthur Harris was completely unambiguous about this, that he regarded his job to bring the masonry crashing down on the top of the Boche, to kill the Boche, and to terrify the Boche. And by the Boche, he meant German civilians. And he did all of these things with the full authority and encouragement of the British government and, in a wider sense, the British people. 800 years of Christian ethical thought say, you do not do this. In fact, they scream, you do not do this. To me, that's pretty significant. But again, I leave it up to my readers to ultimately decide what they think.
Good response. Like that. So finally, I wanted to touch on themes of sort of legacy and the peace after the victory. So the book doesn't end with the victory in 1945, but examines what victory actually meant, politically, socially, and culturally. How does Advance Britannia think about the transition from wartime to post-war Britain, and what lessons might that hold for how we actually remember and interpret this era today?
Well, it's funny because I've seen a few reviews of the book so far, and some of them have taken or detected in the book a rather sort of elegiac or even kind of tragic tone to the book, that the book is about Britain winning the war but losing the peace, which is certainly a refrain you will hear from time to time. I don't think that's really what I intended, and I think that my intention, whether I achieved it or not anyway, was to end on a more optimistic note than that. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that the transition from war to peace was pain-free. It wasn't indeed. The 5 years at the end of the war are very difficult ones for Britain. And I think if you read accounts of what it was like to live through that time, it was a particularly kind of miserable experience. You've got, of course, the continuation of post-war rationing and austerity. You've got the convertibility crisis in 1947, devaluation in 1949. It's a pretty bleak period in lots of different ways, but it doesn't last forever. And by the time you get to the early 1950s, Britain is not only, easing out of wartime austerity, but it's starting to enjoy a huge post-war boom, which is part of a much broader global post-war boom that's being made possible by these new kinds of institutions that have been created at the end of the war, things like the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT free trade agreement, and so on. In many ways, the French call them the 30 glorious years, from the late 40s to the early 70s, the best time ever to have lived certainly in European history. Real GDP more or less doubles in Britain. Working class living standards are transformed. So if you go back and think about, my grandparents who were born, around about the time of the First World War, and probably, you'll have, relatives who were from the same period, they lived in a Britain which was much more powerful on sort of the world stage, but they lived lives which are, I don't think any of us would switch to today, in terms of the kind of the basic quality of life that we enjoy now, the kind of standard of living which we take for granted. This is the thing. When people had worried that Britain was going to suffer from the war, this was true to a certain extent. It was going to transform Britain's place in the world. The war did accelerate Britain's relative decline in international rankings. So, for instance, Germany and France overtake the UK in terms of the size of their economies by the early 60s. The empire does vanish, of course, as, Chamberlain and Churchill had feared that it might. Britain does ultimately become a second-ranked power. It's never the same kind of great power that it had been in 1939. But a lot of these things were probably going to happen anyway, war or no war. Britain's relative economic decline had been going on since the 1870s. The empire goes, yes, but how many people ultimately mourned its loss? One of the things that's most striking about decolonization, actually, in terms of its effect upon the United Kingdom, is how relatively untraumatic and uncontroversial it was. Churchill might have been fighting to prop up the empire, but I'm not really sure that many other people in Britain in 1945 were. Aren't we
Churchill was
now
a Victorian, though, wasn't he?
A sign of... Well, exactly. But I think relatively few other people were in 1945.
Yeah.
And I think the feeling largely was, there's let the empire go on its way, and shouldn't we regard this as being actually a moral achievement? In the end, it disappeared and became a normal country after the Second World War. And it turns out that there are worse things to be than being a normal country. It's almost accidentally become a world-class power in the first place. And reverting back to its natural condition was not perhaps the worst experience that anybody could have. As a kind of final thought to that, I would think currently living in a country which regards itself as being top nation isn't necessarily all it's cracked up to be either sometimes. So there are worse things than being ordinary in the world.
Yeah, it's very diplomatic. Yeah, I think you're right on that one. Alan, that was absolutely fantastic. What a really great discussion, and I'm sure our listeners will really immensely enjoy that. I'll post links to where people can obtain the book. It's available as an audiobook as well, isn't it? I should warn our listeners that if you're going to buy the physical book, it's about, as I said in my previous email to Alan, it's about the size of a small car. So it will take you a while to get through, but it's well worth it. It's absolutely fantastic. It's wonderful and wonderfully written as well. I love Alan's writing style, so hope you'll enjoy it too. So I'll put all the links to where people can.
Well, I'm blushing here, even though you can't see.
Well, no, it's justified. I'll put all the links in the show notes, etc., so people can have a look for themselves. So I think it's fair to say that Advance Britannia offers a thoughtful and deeply human perspective on Britain's war from 1942 onwards. It's been a real pleasure to explore these ideas with you. Particularly, obviously, for our listeners, how Bomber Command fits into the wider story of endurance, escalation, and reckoning, I suppose. So before I close off this episode, I just want to mention that I'm doing an event at the International Bomber Command Centre down in Lincoln on the 5th of March. I'm going to be talking about The Invisible Campaign, my book about Bomber Command's mine-laying operations between 1940 and 1945, and hopefully dispelling quite a few of the myths that have arisen around that particular element of Bomber Command's work. It's one of the International Bomber Command's supper-time lectures, so your price for ticket includes meal, etc. And they're always really, really lovely evenings, so hopefully I'll see some of you there. Again, I'll put the booking link in the show notes as well. So that's just about it for this episode. Thank you all for listening, as always. If you've been enjoying Nevermind the Dam Busters, please consider leaving us a rating or review on your favourite podcast app. It really does help other people to find the show. If you'd like to support the podcast further, you can do so for as little as £2.40 or $3 a month. Again, details in the show notes. You can also join the conversation in our Facebook group or connect with us across social media. We're on all platforms pretty much. Now, coming up next, we'll be turning our attention across the Atlantic as I'm joined by Mike Peters from the Mighty Eighth podcast to discuss daylight bombing raids on Schweinfurt, their objectives, their cost, and what they reveal about the American approach to the bomber war. So we'll be back again very soon. Until then, take care and goodbye.
Free audio post-production by Allphonic.com.